Our next speaker is Pock, whose speech about music theory is sure to make you think a bit more on the intricacies of music.
Try to think back to last summer, when we were all stuck in our houses, bored out of our minds. How many of you opened Spotify and found some random tune at a boredom, or maybe one you listen to a lot? Probably everyone, right? Now, how many of you felt something new or unexpected while listening to that music? I'm Pock, amateur composer and cellist, and over the course of the pandemic, I've gotten the chance to explore my own relationship with music very deeply and think on this question a lot. Now, I'm here to try to talk about meaning and content and emotion in music. Every day, waking up and going through the same plodding monotony of COVID, it's a feeling we all now know too well. And I, being a musician, would say listen to the same Bruckner symphony every day for a week like a backing track to the endless repetition of life in 2020. Then, one day, a friend showed me Krzysztof Penderecki's Threnody for the Victims of Hiroshima, written in 1960. Came quite out of left field, but it was electrifying, a breath of fresh air. Here's an excerpt from the opening. I admit that this is a somewhat myopic view to take of a work which finds its dedication in such horrific tragedy, but I mean only to highlight in the extreme the power music has to decouple one from their circumstances, to illustrate the almost escapist nature that sound possesses. As another example, there's the work which inspired me to write this speech, Luis Dominguez' Gratias Tibi, a profound expression of thanks for essential workers written over the pandemic at the request of the New Jersey Symphony Orchestra. While I was reading the article I found a piece in, comments caught my eye. The orchestra's director remarked thus: Gratias Tibi expresses all of these emotions through the universal language of music, which is, of course, derived from Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's well-worn quote, "Music is the universal language of mankind." Something of a conundrum arises out of these words, for we humans communicate via language, assigning specific meanings to words, which we chain together to build complex ideas. Music defies the rigid structure of words and manages to convey meaning nonetheless. I want to explore this paradox. How does music, the quintessential abstraction of sound, manage to convey meaning? First, we ought to conceive of music as primarily a medium for entertainment. All of the other meaning which has been infused into it throughout the centuries is distinctly secondary. I can imagine a couple of cavemen across the world blowing into a reed and thinking it sounded nice, and maybe even blowing into a reed alongside a friend and thinking it sounded nice as well. Using a piano, we can kind of get a feel for this moment, the hypothetical invention of what we today call harmony, and figure out what sounds played together actually do sound nice. That sounded pretty good. Let's try another combination. Still sounds pretty good. Let's try another one. Now, that just sounds ugly. What's different? Well, for a start, this uglier combination had two notes which were right next to each other. When you contrast that with the first two combinations, you see that the first two had two notes which were further apart. And generally, some experimentation shows that this is true. Notes which are a small distance away from one another sound worse than notes which are a larger distance away from one another. And there's a lot of science which explains this, but suffice it to say that certain distances, intervals as it were, please the brain. Thus, our first step in attacking the question of how music conveys meaning, if we conceive of that meaning in a very simple, reductive sense of emotion or even content, music conveys entertaining content by stimulating our brains. We can even say that these phenomena are biologically situated. And this is obviously not what we mean when we say something like music is the universal language of mankind, but it's a start, considering that most traditions consider that subject a more or less pleasing sound in one way or another. This brings me to my next point. Well, before, we focused on the building blocks of music as being part of these biological structures. The level that most of us engage with music on is a cultural one. The same kinds of recognition and processing are occurring here, but instead of biologically hard-coded intervals into our brains, we process culturally situated patterns. Now, what do I mean by that? I tend to think of music theory as a set of rules, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's useful to explain what comes next. So music theory as this set of rules, even though that's far from true. These rules, quote-unquote, what composers can do and can't do, what music is objectively good and objectively bad, these rules really describe these patterns, cultural patterns, that we're used to, and following those rules gets us music that we are familiar with, that we're used to, that we like. The most macro example is the fundamental idea of tension and resolution, which is kind of the crux of Western music. And now I can only really talk about Western music because music in its full generality is something which is incredibly hard to consider. We rely on this idea of tension and resolution to convey meaning. And we flesh out this basic structure with rhythm, timbre, development, melody, harmony, tempo, etc., etc. We begin to generate meaning. Let's take the example of the plagal cadence, one of the most common formulas for generating that resolution, and look at two distinctly different characterizations that convey two drastically different meanings. First, let's hear plagal cadence alone, by itself. Now let's listen to this excerpt from Bohemian Rhapsody. I'll play it twice, it's so kind of hard to catch at first, but pay attention to the bass. Think about how that feels for a moment. Now we have probably the polar opposite of Brahms' symphony. This one is blatant by comparison. From an analytical standpoint, these things are pretty much the same, minus the change in mode, but they feel really, really different. There are dozens of little genre markers and extra formulas that make the two passages feel just the way they do, but as a start, instrumentation and tempo. Bohemian Rhapsody is fast and just scored for guitar and voice, compared to the drawn-out, richly scored Brahms symphony in all its classical glory. All these small patterns and their larger structural patterns give us essentially a language to work with, where we're listening to and writing music. This is how it's possible for pure music to synthesize new ideas, how it's possible to feel totally bewildered and electrified by a wall of sound. Essentially, every piece of music has to draw on hundreds, if not thousands, of little scattered memories at once, and when you put them all together, sometimes you get a totally new, unexpected combination, which motivates thinking and exploration. Let's put all this into perspective. We're hardwired to love certain sounds, the consonants, or at least not to hate them, and at the same time we're hardwired to dislike others. Composers throughout history build, and have built, on this basic principle of consonance and dissonance, as we call it, pleasing and less pleasing sounds, to create a schema of tension and resolution from which all other elements in music spring. We flesh out this structure to realize music as a referential language, building on the sounds we hear from birth to provide us with a rich personal palette of associations steeped in culture and memory. I hope I've made the sometimes arcane purpose of music theory and the things which explain music a little more clear, even though sometimes music just seems like sound, and we're just going about our days listening to Taylor Swift or BTS and so on. But throughout history, music has always had the potential to be more than sound, to evoke memories, to reach deep inside of the human consciousness, to teach us new things about ourselves and connect us to the world around us. Music can be important and wonderful, and sometimes it sneaks up behind us to give us a reminder of its power to defy our expectations at every turn. I'm Mark Pock, and thank you for listening to my TED Talk.
So, hi Mark, thank you so much for sharing your incredible and fascinating insights about music. Our first question is, how do you think music has impacted your life? Would you be the same without it?
I certainly think I wouldn't be the same thing without music. Honestly, music has been one of the most transformative influences in the past couple of years for me. It opens doors to a new world of creativity that I honestly never could have seen before. And composing has just been, specifically for me, if we think about composing in terms of music, it's been something which has really allowed me to express my creativity in other ways. I think in general, I wouldn't have as big of a perspective on the world as I did. And a lot of things about, let's say, for example, even my political beliefs have actually been formed by my relationship with composing and my relationship with the history behind it. In learning more about music and the people who've created it and transformed it over time, I think I've really been able to get a more full perspective of the world than I ever would have been able to encapsulate otherwise. And I think that really grasps something which is not just true of my experience with music, but which is fundamental to the experience of music as a whole.
So you also mentioned that music is steeped in culture. How do you think music enhances cultural connections and identity?
I would say that music is one of the ways in which cultural identity is backchanneling, as it were. It kind of reinforces cultural identity in a certain sense and is very much almost nationalistic. If we think about music in a certain, definitely this is a kind of Western theory of music to use. But if we look at like the legacy of music, which dates from, let's say, from Beethoven onwards, from about the 1800s onwards, what we see in music is a general trend around the world where music is consistently used and leveraged over time as parts of kind of efforts to reinforce the cultural identity, to kind of bring people closer to their cultural identity. And that's not necessarily either a good thing or a bad thing, but it is true that music also has the power to transcend that, which is kind of what one of the things which I wanted to think about in this speech, with the ways that music functions on a biological level. Right, we're so used to hearing about music that, in a certain context, in that cultural context, that when we become kind of steeped in a cultural milieu, the normal perceptions that we have of music, which is to say simply what's good, what's bad about music, those continue repeating in that self-reinforcing cycle over and over and over again. And that kind of thing is a very, very almost echo chamber-like reinforcement of the cultural identity. So if we stay locked inside of that cultural bubble without exposing ourselves to other kinds of music, it functions in similar ways to a lot of the other isolating mechanisms which we see in these generally cultural structures, or these generally nation-oriented structures.
So last question, would you ever combine music theory with another field of study? And if so, why and what potential do you think it has?
Yes, I think music theory has incredible potential to be combined with all kinds of fields of study. At the beginning, music theory is very much overtly mathematical, right? Like music theory can't be done without math at all. And some people have created really, really interesting mathematical music and music which stems from mathematical ideas. Like there's the idea of microtonal music, which, separates kind of a deconstruction of our 12-tone ecosystem on a more mathematical lines, using more kind of advanced relationships between quarter tones, where we break down the 12 tones that exist on a piano into quarter tones between them. So we end up with 48 tones in the octave before tones repeats, before tones start the same. And now we can have much more advanced and much more different sounds that are overtly based on mathematical ratios. So if we invoke that kind of math in our music, we can already get something which is very, very alien, very foreign. And we can kind of totally transform the sound of our music and break out of that isolation I was talking about earlier. But I also think that music has an incredible potential when you look at it in philosophical or sociological sense. Music has the power to liberate people. Music has the power to lock people in their own minds. Music has the power to be used as propaganda, or music has the power to be used as inspiring cultural critique. The work of several philosophers, over time, the biggest ones that I'm thinking about now are some people from the Frankfurt School who I was actually introduced to recently, taught that music as high art is one of the fundamental kinds of cultural critique that we have in Western society, that music is integral to kind of actually developing a picture of our power structures as they are, and to utilizing that picture towards doing things, whatever we should do with them. The opinion of a lot of philosophers would be divided on what exactly we can do with that better picture that we can achieve from that cultural critique, whether or not music is an overtly positive or negative force for that kind of transformation. But I think everyone can agree that music is definitely a force for creating precision in that sense. So from the start, I would say mathematics, and moving upwards into a more general scale, I would say maybe sociology or maybe philosophy or other related fields.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing with us today, Mark. I really appreciated your talk, and it's something that we don't really hear about very often. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem. It's been a great opportunity.